From the team at CTS, this is the Time Crunch Cyclist Podcast, our show dedicated to answering your training questions and providing actionable advice to help you improve your performance, even if you're strapped for time. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford, and I'm one of the over 50 professional coaches who make up the team at CTS. In each episode, I draw on our team's collective knowledge, other coaches, and experts in the field to provide you with the practical ways to get the most out of your training and ultimately become the best cyclist that you can be. Now, on to our show. Welcome back, Time Crunch fans. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. Training readiness has become a catchy term, in part due to the scores athletes receive from wearable devices. The premise, though, is simple. Are you sufficiently recovered to benefit from training today or in the near future? Or should you rest more before training again? This is a big topic of discussion right now because January is coming up in a few weeks, and that's the traditional start of the training season for athletes with spring and summertime goals. Ideally, you've had a period of mostly aerobic, unstructured training before ramping up into a bigger period of training, such as this 2024 season that's upon us, briefly. But are you ready for it? That's the question I'm going to discuss today with CTS coach, co-author of many books, and content creator Jim Rutberg. Jim, welcome back to the show again.
Thank you, Adam. It's good to be back.
Yeah. And so since we've heard from you before on the previous podcast, which are a top ranking podcast, by the way, of Can You Get Faster in 6 Hours or Less? So if anyone missed that podcast, go ahead and check it out. But since we interviewed last, Ruddy, what have you been up to?
Not a whole lot. Been riding and training myself and raising teenage boys and chasing after them. Yeah. So it's been a good year, and I am certainly one of those athletes who has been taking it relatively easy this fall. And this topic came up between you and I because of kind of looking and seeing what does it take to be ready to start a larger block of training. How do we tell that people are ready? And as you and I talked about, we were gonna turn this around a little bit, and I was going to ask you some of the questions because you have a much better handle on the technical side of this question. I think there are coaches who are stronger on the technical end and some coaches who are stronger on the subjective end, just your coaching style. You're much stronger than I am on the technical side. So I'm curious to find out from you, well, to jump right into it, how do we define training readiness and how do we use all of this wearable data to evaluate it?
Yeah, no, that's just it. And I think having a good mix of both, technical and subjective or subjective is the way, in my opinion, if we're going to use kind of this training readiness. So what the heck is it? I generally describe it to my athletes as not only being motivated to train today, but also, can you perform what's needed based on what training calls for today? Essentially, you're asking yourself, or I'm asking the athlete, how fresh are you mentally and physically, and does that align with actual training? The reason why I separate those two is because we can all, shame ourselves into, I need to go out there and do that 4-hour ride, or I need to get out there and do my 2x20. So I'm negatively motivated to go out and do it. But can you do it?
Yeah, you're training in spite of yourself.
Exactly. So do those things align? That is essentially training readiness, as best as I can describe it to everyone.
So the world right now is overwhelmed with, or very obsessed with, the amount of data that we're able to gather off of wearable devices and HRV and Whoop and the scores and everything else. Are you finding that to be helpful from athletes getting that much data, or is it muddying the waters more so than clarifying it?
I think it muddies before it clarifies, because it really, for any of these wearables to actually work, you need a lot of data. And then once you have the data, you need to correlate it to feeling. So if you get a new wearable, and we'll just go brand and device neutral. If you get a new wearable, it's going to give you a readiness score. It's going to tell you what to do from day one because it measures something, HRV, resting heart rate, past training impulses, whatever. And then it and this is why, like, some devices, you'll go do a ride and you come back and it says rest for 72 hours or, something like this. Is because it's dependent upon past data in order to do it. Even though you do a training thing that's normal for you, you don't need 72 hours of rest. Right. So then as you gain more data, it does get more smart. So again, it muddies the water before you start to actually have some actionable good advice from it. But even from there, if you become the robotic athlete that only looks at the readiness score or the feedback from the device without actually tuning into yourself, it's going to make things a lot worse, right? Because you're not going to tune into yourself. If you get sick, if you get a little injured, if you don't train a bunch and then you try to go back to it, it just sets everything off. So you need some data or some unbiased thing looking upon you, as well as yourself looking upon you, evaluating the real feel of your legs and your body before you go out there and do whatever training says for the day.
We have access to the wearable device data that people upload, and we have access to their past training and their training data through both TrainingPeaks and WKO. How do you use those pieces of software to help to determine whether an athlete's ready to train? And I know, one of the complicating factors with that is that athletes often have access to TrainingPeaks, but they don't necessarily have access to WKO. Yeah. And so we have to be a little careful in terms of what data can athletes actually access and use for themselves.
Yeah. So I'll share some of that data on WKO5 as well as TrainingPeaks. But before I do, I think of it in just two ways of how we actually use training readiness, and it's short-term and long-term. Short-term is the day-to-day training decision, right? So I wake up, I maybe do all my measurements or whatever, or I just ask myself, hey, how did I sleep last night? How am I feeling today? Check TrainingPeaks. 4 hours. Should I do that? Should I not? That's the short-term day-to-day. And then the longer term, or like an annual training plan or a training before I go into a big training phase, that's where I also look at training readiness as far as how the athlete held up in training based on their TSS per day ramp rates and all this kind of stuff. So,
and that's where we are now, because people are at that point of, hopefully they're rested, they're ready to go. They feel like they're anticipating the start of the 2024 season and wanting to get going. And I think part of the reason that you and I wanted to do this podcast was that although January 1 is the traditional start of that, it's also a completely arbitrary date. So if people aren't actually ready because of a variety of other factors, they're too tired, they never actually took a break, they're stressed out, etc., we have to evaluate whether or not January 1 really makes sense for people, or they need a little bit more of a break after the holidays before they ramp up into their season. Or hopefully they look at this information, they do a self-evaluation and go, yep, I am ready to go for 2024 and ready to hit it hard in early January.
Yeah. Yep. That's it. 100%. And I think along with that is if an athlete asks me, like, hey, coach, how's my data looking? Should we hit it hard in January 1 or should we not? Or how should we approach the holidays with all this time that I have coming up? Or how should we approach the holidays when I'm traveling for the next couple of weeks and with family and stress out of my gills, right? So let's look to the training readiness chart on WKO5 that I use when I'm tracking freshness and readiness. To make things as simple as possible, what this training readiness chart is tracking is TSS per day on the y-axis, and then time in weeks and months on the x-axis. In particular, we're looking at the form or the TSB, training stress balance, from the performance management chart on TrainingPeaks, okay, terminology, and I'll show that here in a second. But we're really like focused on that. And this chart goes ahead and clarifies when the athlete could be feeling what relative to this training stress balance. So to make it simple, in yellow we've got fresh. Just under that, we've got optimal performance zone, we've got optimal training zone, overreaching, then overloading. How to read this, and then we have transition up here. How to read this is when we're in the red, that's like, be a little careful, because if we induce a ton of training, which is right here, we're getting into the overload aspect. And for those listening to me right now, if you're like, what the heck is he talking about? Go over to YouTube to get the full visual of this, because we're using a kind of a visual aid, if you will, to describe what we're talking about on training readiness. And you'll only be able to find it on YouTube in this sort of dynamic way.
Right. But if they're listening, think of it as a really heavy day of training. Is going to have a high TSS, is going to be a high TSS day. And that is going to suppress this line graph. It's going to push, it'll be represented by the low points on the line graph. And then as you're either taking easier days or days that are kind of average or are typical for you, you're going to be in more of that optimal performance or optimal training area. A big heavy day is going to push down into this red area on overload. Think of it as kind of they're guardrails. Exactly. So if you're hitting the guardrail on the overload side because the training's been heavy, you got to ease up a bit and get it back into the green zones. If you ease up too much or you just haven't been training, you're going to hit the guardrail on the other side, on the high side of the graph, where you're not getting enough TSS per day to keep your fitness moving in the right direction.
Exactly. And so I think using these guardrails is a great approach for an athlete or a coach to check in on stuff. So if we've got like a big training phase planned, and all of a sudden it indicates to me these red dots of overloading, right? These big troughs. Maybe I want to check in with that athlete, especially if that wasn't pre-programmed. But if it is, all good. Keep moving forward. Additionally, I look back on this as a historic trend to see how the athlete is holding up. Where does he perform best? Because there's some other stuff in the performance management chart via WKO5 that I can look as to how this athlete actually performs relative to where they are in this readiness chart sort of thing. And shout out to Josh Moore. I just talked to him this morning. I've shared his data before on stuff, so he's good with this. What I like to see from this and what I tell the athletes is I educate them on what we're looking at, what this means. And I say, when we're doing like a big fitness build, like January, February for a lot of athletes, I'll say what we need to do is hang out in the green, hang out in this optimal training zone. And what that is inducing training effect to get fitness ramping up. That's kind of how I use this as a teaching tool.
So the optimal training green area, which is a little bit more of a training load, versus the optimal performance area where it's a lighter green, but is, and in relative to the performance management chart in TrainingPeaks, which more people will have access to than have access to WKO, they're going to see this as a trough in TSB, hitting the low points in TSB, and then where people are recovering or are getting back to an optimal training zone is when TSB might be a little negative, but is not a huge trough. So it's the deviation from the average that's causing either the benefit or the problem.
Exactly. And what I'm doing now is I'm sharing what anybody who uses TrainingPeaks has access to, and this is your performance management chart. You go there by going online, like on your desktop, laptop, and go to calendar, go over to your dashboard, and then you click on performance management. And just in general concepts, now this is a separate athlete. So for the data nerds who are really tracking this, like, hey, that doesn't look the same. It's not. It's also a different timeline. But the concept here is the same, where form or TSB at the trough or the lowest point, this is the highest fatigue of the athlete. Okay, so check in perhaps with the athlete there because it's a time of heavy stress. Whether you program that in as a coach or not. And the reason why I'm sharing a lot of this data here is because from a quote training readiness standpoint, all of this readiness or this score, if you will, is based in TSS per day, which is a lot of what our fitness modeling and our performance modeling goes from, as opposed to HRV or resting heart rate or some super out there algorithm from whatever device you're using to tell you that you're ready to train or not. This is using the same concept, same terminology that we are in prescribing training, or using the same language that we use in training to model your readiness. So I think this is a much better fit for those who have good data.
So then, do you see, because you work with athletes who have long histories of training data in WKO and TrainingPeaks, and who also have a pretty good history of training with or using wearable devices. Have you seen a good correlation between person hits one of these troughs in TSB and the wearable devices are telling them similar information that they're tired and not ready to train? Or should people expect that these things should align, or have you seen that they are not aligning as much?
It really depends. It's a great question for sure. And I think the best answer I can give to you is it really depends on athlete phenotype and their fitness rolling into it. So, for example, on a trough like this, if I've got a sprinter or like a really anaerobic athlete, if I had a trough occur like this, they would simply be tired. Okay, ATL has spiked up, decent training leading into it, but now they're tired. Whereas like a domestique or a climber or something like this, somebody who's more aerobically favored, if you will, they're probably feeling decent, maybe a little tired here, but they're feeling pretty good at a suppressed training stress balance. Even more so that more aerobic athlete, climber type, probably feeling even better as they're coming out of the trough. So we're a negative TSB, but we're rising up, versus a sprinter who's feeling better when it's something perhaps like this, where the form is positive and uprising, but it hasn't reached this like probably transition time period over here where they might be getting a little stale at that point. So those are the trends that I find.
Does that mean that from a training readiness standpoint, that the anaerobic type athlete, the sprinters, they're highly affected by like acute fatigue? They don't feel good unless they're fresh. Like they need to freshen up in order to feel good. Whereas the highly aerobic people, the time trial, the people who can tempo all day kind of folks, they may feel better when they are carrying a little bit more fatigue. The NTSB is a little bit lower just because of the kind of athlete and the kind of stress that they thrive under.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's really important to identify that by looking at data over time. The way I like to do it is on WKO5, I have performance measurements like peak 5-minute, 20-minute, 60-minute powers overlaid on a performance management chart like this. So what you can do is, if you're using TrainingPeaks online here, is you can go identify when some of these peak power durations occurred, and then go look at what your TSB was relative to that date, and look at like, was I upward trending? Was I downward trending? Was I super fresh? You can start to see the patterns of when you're making your best power. And that's how you can identify when you come into a good training readiness standpoint.
So Adam, we have a range of athletes that you and I work with and CTS works with, for instance, and some of them are really into their data and other people are guided a lot more by feel and subjective evaluations. How do we use some of the lower tech or no tech kind of subjective measures to figure out whether a person is ready to train?
Yeah, this is, in my opinion, this is where it's at, because we need to incorporate low tech or old school along with new tech if you're using this new tech. And I'll start first by very broadly saying you need more self-awareness. You need to tune into yourself. Without it, none of this means anything. It's all out the window. And so this is asking yourself, do you feel fresh? Did you have good sleep last night? How do your legs feel? Which is something I ask my athletes all the time. And are you motivated? What's your motivation right now? So how you cultivate self-awareness, you could probably read, books on philosophy for days about that. In the way of training, it's a continual conversation with yourself. However, you can use some of these tools in order to kind of orchestrate it. I like my athletes using metrics on TrainingPeaks as well as simply talking to them on the phone. So metrics on TrainingPeaks, you can click on a little positive icon on the day, pull that up. And for my athletes, I've got anything from, sleep quality to mood, HRV, recovery status, motivation, all this kind of stuff. And going through that process helps the athlete bring awareness to how they truly are feeling, as opposed to waking up, getting the kids going out the door for the day, rolling into work and never really having a thought of your freshness for the day. Or maybe the only thought was, oh man, my back, and sleep to go. Okay, charge forward into the day, right?
So you use a process of recording the metrics as a self check-in on a daily basis so that they get used to checking in with themselves and seeing how they feel, so that it's not kind of a random evaluation. You try to get them to do it on a regular basis so that they get more attuned to the differences from day to day.
It's one way, right? And it's one actionable way of doing it for somebody who has, say, lower awareness, where we need to work on it. The end goal would be to not, go on TrainingPeaks to cultivate that self-awareness. I would say the end goal is what I do with my athletes on a very regular basis, pretty much every day, is follow the training program. And before you make any decision on, do I do intervals today or not, whatever the workout is, warm up first. Warm up, do a couple of openers, then decide about your main set. If I feel good and have good sensations, proceed with the main set. If I'm like, whew, these legs are more heavy than I thought, okay, let's just ride some endurance. Let's do a recovery ride, whatever. Head home, freshen up, and let's push those intervals to the next day. Because whatever caused the heaviness, whatever is causing this fatigue, whether it was yesterday's training, poor night's sleep, low food intake, whatever it is, we should adjust based on what your body's telling you.
And this is the area I think that people get confused, because there's a pressure to push through. There's a pressure to say, well, no pain, no gain, and right. I feel tired, but I need to get this done, etc. And then there's the other side that says, well, you're only going to perform well if you are rested and fresh. So how do we help people to figure out whether the today or this week, etc., is a push through kind of a situation, or I need to listen to my body and take more rest situation?
Yeah. Personally, I don't think that there's any way to get there without some trial and error and messing up along the way. So get it wrong, punch through sometimes, and watch your power go down and be like, okay, I guess I should have listened to myself in the warm up when my legs were heavy, for example. And sometimes, like I showed you on the training readiness chart, is maybe you have these days of overreaching and there's a certain time period to do that. But then if you're seeing day after day of overreaching, now dial it back. Okay, really freshen up, because this fatigue hole that you're getting into, feel it and then come back. And I think that these subjective feelings, this is a little bit of like the old school approach of sorts of like, go dip your toe in that, maybe make a mistake and then come back. But I also think that there's signs of readiness that you can, identify kind of within yourself that, you talked about in your article that I think came out a couple of weeks ago now. And I don't know, do you want to speak on that? Because I think that holds a ton of weight even today, whether we call it old school or low tech or whatever.
Yeah, and that one talked a bit more about the readiness for moving from, say, a transition period of the year to it's time to get rolling into 2024, rolling into a new season. Because, so from the acute standpoint, I think people see their heart rate is more responsive. So if you go hard and then when you back off, your heart rate drops relatively quickly, or you start to put in an effort, you go up a hill or something like that, your heart rate has greater agility or more mobility within responsiveness to efforts. I think that that's a sign that people can look at and go, okay, my body is actually responding to training. When I go harder, heart rate ramps up, and then when I recover, it's actually moving again. If people are not ready to train, I find their effort level and RPE stays this might move, but their heart rate stays the same. There's very little variability, and I'm not talking heart rate variability from a resting standpoint, like the measurements we take in the morning, more of how responsive is your heart rate during a workout itself. The other one is you can actually accelerate. When people are ready to go and train, it can be as simple as when you leave a stoplight or a stop sign, you can hit the gas and get up to speed. And if you're not able to, and it's a grind and you're sluggish, there's a reason for that. I mean, so I think you do your warm up and see, do I feel sluggish? Are my legs heavy? Is my heart rate not responding? And those things, not by themselves, but in correlation with how I feel and whether I'm motivated, et cetera, can be a good indicator of, are you ready or not? And then on the long-term side of seasonality, how excited are you for this?
Yeah.
Like, are you looking at January and going, okay, I'm ready to go, and you're counting down the days to getting started into 24? Or is it, oh, shoot, I only have 2 weeks left of break time, so to speak, and then I got to start this again? Like, that's a big indicator, because an athlete who's actually recovered is going to start getting antsy. They're going to start getting eager to train. When they go for rides, it's like the dog on the leash. They want to go. They want to accelerate. They want to test themselves. They want to charge every hill that they get to, and they're holding themselves back, maybe because we've told them that it's transition period and they should stay in zone 2 and all that kind of stuff. But the athlete that's ready to go is almost struggling to hold themselves back in that because they're so eager to get on with it. If we can get athletes to that point going into January, I think that's great. If it's the opposite, they look at January like this task that has to be accomplished. Like, oh shoot, I got to start, really ramping up in order to get to my goals. That's more problematic to me, because it means that, yeah, they're ready to commit to it, but they're ready to commit to it because it's a task that they've put on their calendar, not because they're actually ready to train.
Yeah. And I mean, it's as simple as that, in my opinion. And you don't need a metric to tell you that. And I think it's from the longer term sort of scenario of training readiness. If you're the person that's been like flogging yourself at the group ride in December and like getting all these miles because you have more time, don't charge into January with all the New Year's resolution and hit Zwift and all this kind of stuff because everyone else is. It's like pump the brakes, take a break, all good. Meanwhile, if December stresses you out because of, wrapping up work projects, making a push to the holidays, travel, everybody has COVID, everybody has flu, January 1st comes around, don't hit it. Because if you're not ready, if you're not like itching to go, it's not going to be fruitful. And that like itching to go, like you just want to go fast. It's also that time period of what I try to bring my athletes into for a nice like peak performance or a taper, right? And I would say that the feelings are similar, but in this way, that training readiness is really like more of a like clean slate. No, like, let's try not to have too much fatigue in the system mentally and physically before we like put in this kind of like big locomotive training effect ramping up into training peaks. But I think that to make it really, really simple, wait until you're like ready to go before you impose that stress upon you, because training is stressful. It should be stressful.
You made a good point that there's a difference between the rest and eagerness that come from a taper and the rest and eagerness that come from a substantial period of unloading or deloading, a transition period where the thing that's in front of people right now is a long process. This next season that we're coming into is a big build. I mean, they're going to go from it's January and maybe your goals are in June and July and August. And that's a hefty, intimidating thing to kind of ramp yourself into. Whereas the taper example is your event, which is probably a 1 day or a week or something like that, is a couple weeks out, and you're getting eager to perform at your highest level, but you're getting ready for an acute stress or an acute event. Whereas what people are ramping up into right now is more okay, am I ready for a 3-month, 4-month, 5-month build to my events? And that can either be exciting or really intimidating. And I think if you did things correctly in the fall, you should be getting antsy and eager for the work and the process that is coming, because you're ready, you've rested, you've unloaded the stress from the previous season, and you're looking at this long ramp and thinking, there's a lot to be done and a lot of fun to be had, and I'm physically and mentally ready for it.
Yeah, no, that's 100% correct. And so, Ruddy, it's kind of like wrap this thing up and give you the final words here. If we've got listeners asking themselves right now, just like, oh, am I ready for that big build? And they're asking, and this podcast is making themselves ask that question. What should they double down on? What things should they be looking at to identify if they're ready for that big 5-month build of fitness?
Honestly, I think that we're 2 weeks out from the end of the year, and if you're going to put a start point on the next season, for instance, and it's an arbitrary date, January 1. So if you have time, you could just ramp up now if you wanted to. But if you're trying to have a demarcation of when does this start, then I think giving yourself real downtime before getting into that start can be important, because people aren't making as much of a distinction between the end of one thing and the beginning of another. And as we go into the 2024 season and we're in the middle of December, if you say, look, I'm just going to make sure that I'm rested when I hit January. I'm going to make sure that I've reduced the stress as much as I can, and I've made myself physically and mentally ready for what's coming. I think giving yourself a good break and giving yourself some good recovery time can be very helpful.
Yep. And along with that, I would add, just keep it simple. Get to know yourself. And if this holiday season you have a little extra time, I would put more emphasis on that. Cultivating awareness, getting in tune with your body. Sure, ride some miles. But if you want, first week of January as your time to get after it, like pump the brakes a little bit over the holidays, enjoy some downtime, probably catch up on some sleep. I think that can be a blanket statement for many time-crunched athletes. With that, Ruddy, thank you for talking about training readiness today, talking about, old school, new school ways of doing it. But in the end, we're all talking about the same thing. It's getting ready to get after it in training and going after some big goals to start the new year. So thanks again for coming on the podcast. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Always good to be here.
Thanks for joining us on the Time Crunch Cyclist podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you want even more actionable training advice, head over to trainright.com/newsletter and subscribe to our free weekly publication. Each week, you'll get in-depth training content that goes beyond what we cover here on the podcast that'll help you take your training to the next level. That's all for now. Until next time, train hard, train smart, train right.